Hi there, and welcome back to Prices at the Pumps, our weekly look at all things energy related. Scott Squires, pleased to be joined as always by energy expert Dan McTeague. Dan, gosh, have we got a few things to talk about today? But first things first, everybody wants to know what's happening with Prices at the Pumps. We're doing it on a Thursday this week, so Newfoundland and Labrador would have already set there. So what's going on there, and what can the rest of Atlantic Canada expect?
So they saw a 3 cent decrease for gasoline and just under that amount for diesel. So given that we had another day of trade, which saw prices in all arrows moving down, with the exception of diesel, you're looking at gasoline dropping at least 3, maybe even 3.2 cents a liter for Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI. That's what the market is suggesting. The other factor is diesel. It will still come down, but probably only by 2 cents a liter. Nevertheless, it is certainly welcome news at a time in which the temperature is starting to drop, and diesel, like home heating fuel, is at this time of year usually heading up. So take advantage of it while you can and wait until Friday to fill up, as it were.
Dan, something that made headlines very recently was the federal government announcing, for lack of a better term, a pause on the carbon tax on home heating fuel in the Atlantic region. What was your take on that, and what are your thoughts?
Totally predictable. I had actually said the same thing many, many months ago. We had done 2 studies on the cost of carbon taxes being inflationary, hurting the people who are the most vulnerable, not just Atlantic Canada, but right across the country. We were successful in convincing the Atlantic premiers to prevent the imposition of the clean fuel standard on heating oil, which was removed prior to 2021. But I had also made it very clear right here on SaltWire that, at the end of June, the effect of having 2 carbon taxes on diesel and gasoline would be catastrophic for many in Atlantic Canada. And it's fairly clear that the so-called Atlantic liberal wall had crumbled as a result. And in a very short period of time, we also saw a trajectory sea lane change, if you will, in political support for the federal Liberals who have been advocating and pushing this policy, not just, of course, the carbon taxes, but other standards and other regulations, including but not limited to building code changes, methane caps, emissions caps, just transition. I mean, the list goes on, each of them having probably very little consideration by most people up until you have to pay for it. And in my view, what changed all this, Scott, is what you and I discussed well before anyone else did in Canada. And that's the one fell swoop increase of about 25 to 26 cents a liter, which we saw on the 1st of July just this past year. I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Very predictable, but too many trendy people out there who didn't want to take into consideration that this would be a seminal point of pushback, which I think consumers are now starting to realize. Yeah, all those other issues are important, but when it comes to fooling around with people's pocketbooks and making life arduous and unaffordable and unnecessary, I think that's when you see that the Liberal support has crossed the Rubicon, and it's not likely to recover.
Dan, you spent 18 years as a Liberal MP, so you have a good sense of the ebb and flow of opinions and where parties are and where things are going. And I mention that because after it was announced about pausing the carbon tax on home heating fuel in the Atlantic region, there were other provinces, other officials who came out and said, wait a second, what about us? What about us here in this province or that province? What's your take on that? And how are you seeing other governments and other provinces react to the federal government pausing it in Atlantic Canada? And what could it mean going forward?
Well, it's alienated the rest of the country. And the argument, which is a legitimate one, is that there, people who are suffering and can't afford these higher prices. And I'm not just referring to the carbon tax imposed on heating fuels and on transportation fuels. I'm also referring to the fact that these prices are cascading through the economy. Our good friend Sylvain Charlevoix, the food professor, has made a very strong argument, very similar to the one I have been making for over several years, that the inflationary impact of increasing taxes on gasoline and on energy is in itself inflationary and cascades through the economy. So it's pretty clear that one takeaway is that the carbon tax policy and the net zero framework policy around it is dead on arrival. It's over. And I think people who've been involved with these shenanigans, who've done very well by them, who've grifted from them, who believe that this is the way to go ahead, I think the whole thing is going to have to be rethought. And it'll probably take a new government to do that. But you can't have exceptions in one region of the country and the rest of the country is forced to pay. Either you have a carbon tax policy that's applied evenly, and the wisdom of that policy is that everyone gets rebates sufficient to cover the damage or the hit or the inflationary impact. But when you have the Bank of Canada now saying these policies are inflationary, reluctant as they are, the gig is up. The game is over. And I think those out there who believe in, climate policies are paramount and have to happen. And Canada, with 1.4% of all the emissions produced in the world, of which the atmosphere is 0.04%, of which human involvement is 3%, and we're 1.3, 1.4%. I think it is a ruse. And I believe it's now time more than ever for smarter representatives to recognize that they've got to go back to the drawing board here and stop whacking Canadians over the head, especially when they need things like heating oil, when they need natural gas or propane to keep themselves warm. These are necessities. No government in my time or previous to my time would ever dare tax that. This one did, and it's learning a very, very significant lesson.
And whether coincidentally or not, right around the same time as this pause on the carbon tax for Atlantic Canadian home heating fuel was announced, and more pressure got turned up on the federal government by voices saying that, this needs to be looked at and talked about, I started seeing an awful lot of posts and ads or whatever you want to call it, talking about, oh, by the way, heat pumps. The government will help you. Heat pumps. I don't know a whole lot about heat pumps. I know you know more than I do, Dan, but what's your thoughts on this all of a sudden campaign to get a heat pump?
It's not an alternative in Canada. It may work in warmer climates, but it doesn't work in Canada. By the way, anybody who thinks that I'm just saying these because I don't like the alternative, just punch in the name McTeague and Electric, Whitby, Ontario. My family is a long-standing family of, in HVAC, plumbing, and of course, electricity. This is not the kind of solution that they believe it is, unless we're talking about, in-ground geothermal heat pumps. That's a different kettle of fish and a very different and very costly alternative that can't be used in many cities because you don't have the land for it. But the reality is that this is seen as some kind of panacea to those using heating oil. It's not. It's very costly. And those who are looking to get a grant to take advantage of this may find that they don't qualify. Not only is the threshold for qualification too high, in other words, no more than $75,000 a year, the upfront costs are terrible. So people understand a heat pump basically operates, it withdraws, it takes out the heat in the air. No matter how cold it may be, the idea is that there are still molecules there that it's able to convert into heat. And that works if you have it in the ground because it's always 55 degrees, great in the summer for air conditioning. But in the winter, it's minus 15 and minus 20. There is no heat to convert from cold air into making your furnace operate. Second of all, you need a backup furnace anyways. And most insurance companies will not allow you to run an air heat pump without some kind of backup system. They're worried about the fact that it won't work, it will fail, and your pipes will freeze and inevitably cost them a lot of money. That aside, I think those who propose heat pumps haven't spent a lot of time, like their carbon policies, on thinking about the real impacts. And in a cold country like Canada, I don't mean to be disrespectful and understand the pushback from people who are selling these things, but true electricians will tell you they're garbage.
Dan, so much going on right now geopolitically, the war in Ukraine still raging, the situation over in the Middle East, a lot of volatility right around the globe right now. What are you seeing geopolitically and internationally that may, and I say may, have an effect on what's happening with our oil supply and the price of oil going forward?
Prices are coming down. And we've seen that. We're going to see that here this week in Atlantic Canada. And the reflection of the fact that the markets, energy traders, may be, employing or not reading the signals correctly. Two wars, which have the potential to become far greater. A pause apparently now by central banks that they're not going to be increasing interest rates anytime soon. and lower prices may very well begin to push up demand at a time in which the global inventories of oil remain very low. I'm going to be watching next month, and you and I will be talking about this, Scott. The expectation is that OPEC Plus will continue going well beyond December in its desire to cut and to maintain a 3 million barrel production cut in terms of a quota. They're going to do that because they're watching markets move towards $90 a barrel and then collapse to 80. They've had enough of the shenanigans and the little tap dance by the Biden administration to go find oil in Venezuela or curry favor with, as they did prior to the war in Israel and Gaza, curry favor with Iran, who is basically back to levels they haven't never seen in terms of production of oil. So I think we're going to be looking at sanctions sooner or later. The fact that Iranian proxies are involved in this war is not lost on those out there who know that if the Biden administration hasn't got the guts to stand up to Iranian aggression and its proxies, someone else will. But I believe we're still on the cusp edge of the markets finally considering and refusing to discount supply and demand fundamentals. The longer they go on, the more damage it's going to do, and the more likely that we're going to wind up with a very serious supply shortage, especially in a time of great geopolitical tension.
Dan, always lots of different things to discuss each week, and I know that we'll have more again next week. But before we wrap up here, as we do this on Thursday, Halloween a couple of days ago, what was the trick-or-treater level like at your house there in Ontario?
It was pretty good, actually. Very surprised that despite the colder temps, the kids did come out, and they did, in fact, make the doorbell earn its keep for once, as did the amount of candy. My goodness, the price of candy and chocolate bars has skyrocketed. I think I'm going to put some money, if I can ever find some, in the futures of chocolate markets.
Yeah, when I was buying chips and chocolates ahead of Halloween, I felt like I was buying chicken and beef with the prices the way they were. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to set aside a little extra money here for these chocolates and chips. I had three, count them, three trick-or-treaters.
That's it?
That was it. But the three trick-or-treaters that I had, Dan, were delightful. It was a cowboy, a witch, and a banana. They had great personalities. It was a lot of fun. So even though I only had three, they made Halloween worthwhile. So now, did you dress up, Dan? I know we had talked about a potential costume for Dan McTeague. Did you dress up or no?
I'm pretty scary the way I look. It kept a lot of kids away. I had about 30, and of the 30, I'd say most of them had it looks like vampires and Paw Patrol paraphernalia was in vogue on Tuesday night.
Well, Dan, always great to speak with you. Enjoy the rest of your week. Have a wonderful weekend ahead, and we'll get together and do this again next week.
You as well, Scott. Looking forward to it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.